name's Jessica Deighton. I'm Head of Schools Research and Evaluation at the Anna Freud Centre. I'm also Deputy Director of the Evidence-Based Practice Unit, which is based across the Anna Freud Centre and UCL. And today I wanted to talk to you a bit about, give you a bit of background on conceptualising resilience. I think probably you all know lots about resilience, but there's lots of different ways of understanding resilience, so to give a sort of sense of how I understand it, and I think how others at the Anna Freud Centre might understand, though some have different views. Also to give you an introduction to Head Start, which you may or may not be aware of, which is a big lottery-funded programme which is around fostering resilience in schools and also in communities for young people. To share some sort of tentative early findings from the data we've collected and let you know what the next steps are, and also a small request for information at the end, which is related but slightly distinct. So this is some background you'll probably be familiar with. It might be your lived experience. So in a class of 20 young people, we might expect 2 to 3 to experience mental health problems. So that might be emotional problems or behavioural problems. And in recent years, it seems that although behavioural problems might be sort of tailing off or levelling off, there's certainly recent research to suggest that for girls at least, emotional problems do seem to be on the rise. And there's a number of well-established risk factors that the literature points to, but that you may be part of your sort of experience of working with young people. Some of these are individual factors, so we know that gender is a big one for, boys are more likely to have behavioural problems, girls more likely to have emotional problems on the whole. IQ, self-esteem, but also problem solving and other internal characteristics. Community factors, so if children are living in unsafe neighbourhoods or have bad relationships with their neighbours or live in violent communities, then that's a risk factor for mental health problems. And there's a range of family factors, so these are just a couple of examples of harsh parenting and obviously neglect or abuse, but also parental mental health problems put children at risk of mental health problems themselves. And if they are isolated or experiencing bullying, then they're also more likely to have mental health problems. And the literature tells us that the more of these risk factors that young people have, the more likely the negative outcomes are for those children. However, it's true to say that there are a large amount of young people, a sizable portion of young people who have experience of some of these risk factors, or many of these risk factors, who actually don't go on to experience mental health problems. So that sort of leads to the question, so what differentiates these young people? So why are some young people actually functioning well in the context of adversity, but others are not able to do so? So who struggles and who manages to achieve better outcomes and why? And this is where resilience research and the interest in resilience, I think, comes from. But it's a very complicated area. I think there are lots of different ways that people understand what resilience is, and it's become a sort of a new buzzword, certainly in recent years, and is used often as synonymous with character and grit. And I think that's led to people thinking of resilience in different ways. So this is just, I'm not going to read all of these out, but in the middle is the Tower of Babel, and this is a range of very impressive academics and their particular take on what they believe resilience is. So we have Jay Belsky saying that actually it's more about differential susceptibility to environments that we're talking about, not about resilience per se. We've got Angie Hart saying it's about beating the odds whilst changing the odds. And then we have Michael Rutter saying it's more sort of about the positive end of the distribution of outcomes for people experiencing high risk. So there's a large range out there, and I think there's also been a tendency recently to think about resilience as a particular quality. But I think what a lot of these definitions have in common really is that what they're talking about, and I've just focused on this one because I think it's sort of a nice small one to sort of get to the kernel of what resilience is about. So Anne Maston says it's the maintenance of positive adjustment under challenging life conditions. So it's not a thing or a trait by that definition, it's a relationship. It's a relationship between an outcome and a context. So it requires the presence of risk and also a positive outcome. A positive outcome in the absence of risk is not resilience. It's a good outcome, but it's not resilience. So that's not what resilience is about. So then the question is, why is it important? Well, I think by studying resilience and understanding what differentiates those who function well in adversity, we can start to think about what are the features that they experience that allow them to thrive in very difficult conditions? So what is the range of support required actually for those young people to allow them to flourish? And what are the internal characteristics or resources that we can foster in children and young people that allow them to get from a position where they're struggling to where they're managing? And what we would call this range of internal and external characteristics is protective factors. And I think that's often what people think resilience is. That's when we talk about it, it's a shortcut, I think, to say resilience is this thing. So protective factors really are the range of support required and the characteristics. So we're talking about things like where children have good emotion regulation, good problem-solving skills, they're able to cope and self-manage well. Those are the things that might differentiate those young people who do well from those who don't do so well. But also it's important not to forget, it's not just about internal characteristics, it's about what's around that child as well. So it's about having supportive relationships with their parents, with their peers, and crucially with teachers. It's about having supportive structures around them, so the wider context, is the community supportive? Is the school ethos supportive? Are the policies and wider frameworks that that child operates within sort of supporting and holding them? So, yeah, so it's a balancing act really. It's obvious that where there are more risks and fewer protective factors, the more likely it is that there are negative outcomes for a child. From pointing the wrong way. And where we manage to bolster those protective factors and foster them, then they're more likely to achieve good outcomes. And that's really what resilience research is about. It's not about trying to remove risks necessarily, we're not always in a position to do that, but it is about trying to foster these protective factors, be that sort of supporting the internal characteristics or creating environments that the child feels supported within. So I just want to give you one example of a programme that's trying to do this at the moment, which is Head Start. And I lead the evaluation of Head Start at the moment. It's in a sort of pilot phase, and that involves 12 partnerships across England. The majority are local authority led, although one is, I think, voluntary sector. But the idea is that they're working in partnership with those in the local context, so with the voluntary sector, with youth justice, with public health, and with health. And they are working at models to support children and young people. They're focused particularly on children aged 10 to 16 to try and find ways to foster those protective factors and support young people in the context of risk. The models are almost bewilderingly different across these 12 partnerships because they're focusing very much on their local context. And each of them have a sort of a plethora of interventions that are looking at everything from peer mentoring to teacher training to equine therapy, a lot of whole school approaches as a sort of a bedrock, if you like, for more targeted work. So they all involve some whole school work, some targeted work, but also work within the community and with young people who are out of school. And they're all trying to achieve a sort of whole system change, so to try and get the community and the school to support emotional well-being in children and young people. And as part of the evaluation, we've been tasked with answering some sort of crucial primary questions about sort of how Head Start is going. So the first question we're trying to answer is, has resilience increased in children and young people in the partnerships? So are there more young people that have good emotional well-being in the context of risk? What have the partnerships done to increase resilience? What are the kind of activities that they are supporting young people through? And can we make a link between these changes in emotional well-being in the context of risk and what the partnerships are doing? Because it's quite tricky. This is not a usual research design. This is people implementing things in a flexible way that makes sense to their context. So to answer these questions, we've taken a range of methods to try and sort of take different perspectives on whether this approach is working. So one is a large-scale school-based survey, which involves questions not unlike the ones that Emma's just been describing, actually. And the other is qualitative studies where we're scoping out with the partnerships, trying to get them to characterise what their approach is, and if we were to distill it down, what would it look like? And also in-depth case studies and some of the interventions that they're doing to try and understand what young people are reporting about, what's changed for them, and how they found the intervention that they're receiving. So just to explain a little bit more about that Selfreport survey, it's got a number of domains. I just wanted to pull out 3 really here. So one, actually, nicely, is a measure you've already seen this morning, which we're calling general well-being for these purposes. But do you remember the smiley scale that you saw with the sort of no particular points on it, but just a sliding scale? So we asked young people to answer that about how they're doing generally and how are things with their family and so on. And also a mental health questionnaire, not unlike the SDQ, but it just has two dimensions, emotional and behavioural difficulties. And then a measure which is called a resilience measure, but in actual fact, I suppose, tries to get at those protective factors that we were talking about before. So it asks them about the supports around there, but also asks them about some of their own personal characteristics as well. And we collected data from children between the ages of 10 and 14 in just under 100 schools, or maybe, I think about 90 schools in fact, from just under 8,000 children at the end of last year. And we also have data, which I'm not going to tell you about at the moment, but we also have data from the National Pupil Database, which is all the schools-based data on free school meals, special educational needs, deprivation and so on. So we've just begun to tentatively look at this self-report data now without having the sort of schools data added in. So I just wanted to share with you some sort of early findings, if you like. So the first thing is, slightly lost here, but it's just a health warning. Because this is baseline data, it's cross-sectional. So I will explain what this means in a minute, but we're kind of inferring direction because theory and research literature would tell us that this is the direction of effects, but we can't actually establish that with these data at the moment. This is sort of hypothesizing, thinking out at this moment. When the next wave of data comes, we'll look a bit more at the causal relationships. So this was us trying to understand, so we've categorized some of these protective factors from our resilience survey to say, okay, if we're looking at the sort of the external supports of the child, what are the relationships with the emotional difficulties and the behavioural difficulties? So I feel like a bit like a weather girl. I'm going to hop around this side just so I can point at things. So essentially this is a statistical model, but all it really is showing is the relationship between these protective factors and those outcomes. There's some numbers on here. Basically, the stronger the relationship, the nearer the number is to 1. If it's a positive number, it means that as one goes up, the other goes up. If it's negative, it means as one goes up, the other goes down. But I'll talk through. I've made some of the lines thicker just so you can see where the effect's stronger by eyeballing without having to look at all the numbers. So I suppose the main thing to note here is that the biggest predictor, in inverted commas, at the moment of emotional behavioural difficulties from these external supports is family connection, and that's perhaps no surprise. It's particularly strong in its relationship with behavioural difficulties. And then we looked at, well, okay, is it about, that's about sort of how supported the young people feel, but what about engaging in activities in those environments, so engaging in activities in the home, feeling like they make a contribution to the home or the community. And community seems to have quite a weak impact, in fact, in this respect, on emotional behavioural difficulties. But again, activity within the home is quite strongly related. We'd call this a sort of moderate effect size, so it's quite substantial to emotional difficulties and behavioural difficulties. And the final one, this is just a range of these personal characteristics that we were talking about. So looking at which of these are most sort of strongly related to emotional difficulties, behavioural difficulties, we can see for emotional difficulties, self-esteem, empathy and problem solving are quite highly related. Now, some of this might be because some of these concepts are quite closely related to one another. So self-esteem and emotional difficulties, they're quite similar. So it's just bearing in mind that sometimes it might not be a causal relationship. It might just be that the two things are very strongly correlated. And in terms of behavioural difficulties, the effects are somewhat weaker, but goals and aspirations and self-esteem seem to be emerging. Interestingly, there is a positive relationship between problem solving and behavioural difficulties here, such that the better they are at problem solving, the more behavioural difficulties they seem to have. I'm not quite sure what that's about at this moment, and I think until we look more at the analysis, I wouldn't like to say that that was a substantive finding. So this is really just summarising what I just said, that for emotional problems, it looks like family connection, engagement in the home, self-esteem, empathy and problem solving appear to have the strongest relationship with emotional problems. And for behavioural problems it seems to be similar things but fewer. So family connection, engagement in the home, self-esteem and goals and aspirations. So in terms of next steps, well for the programme as a whole, there is a next phase to Head Start now. So each of those 12 partnerships have just submitted a proposal of what they would like to do for the next 6 years. So the idea is that they've learned and consolidated over the last 2 years, and they're now proposing a new, well, not necessarily a completely new approach, but they are refining their approach going forward. So they're going to hear in the next couple of months whether they are able to take that forward. And similarly, the evaluation has a next stage. We hope that we would be able to take that forward, but we will see. We have some work to do in terms of our own analysis now, so we would like to go back and look at the risk factors now we have the schools data and see whether those protective factors are working the way we think they are. Are they intervening, in essence, between risk and outcome? And that's what we'll be looking at over the coming months. We've also been working quite closely with all the partnerships to develop a common measurement framework. So taking some of the measures like Emma described earlier and trying to say if we were trying to understand what positive wellbeing looked like in schools and what reducing the onset of mental health problems look like in schools, how would we measure that? But also a wider picture, how do we know, what characteristics of an intervention have the greatest impact? How do we know how these protective factors intervene? So we're working with them to develop this comprehensive measurement framework. And we're trying to feed any learning that we have from that into other projects, but also to share with schools and to share with Cork, who are joining us with that. So that's where Head Start is up to. My next slide is my request for help. So this is an example, I suppose, of where we're feeding the learning from Head Start in. So we have been commissioned by Public Health England to create some guidance materials for schools with Cork about how we measure positive wellbeing within schools. So one of the first things we want to understand is what measures for wellbeing or resilience or mental health that schools are already using. So for those of you who are based in schools or working with schools, we'd really like to know about what you have heard about what you use and how you use them. So, do you use measures termly, once a year, every couple of years? Is it something that's requested by the local authority, or is it something that the school is school driven? And how's the information used? Is it used for Ofsted frameworks, or is it used to plan support? And what you think of the approaches you've tried. So it's, and Emma's got there's some forms. If you could just write some notes on that, would be great. But if any of you have particular experience or something you'd like to tell us about what you've used, that would be really helpful. There's space for contact details, but also I'll be around. And the aim is to create guidance materials and give examples of best practice so that we can share that with schools and colleges. So that they've got a sort of a one-stop shop really for these kinds of resources. Okay, that's it. Does anyone have any questions or thoughts?